So continuing from last podcast, I think I was talking about how when you're on something like psilocybin, your body will actually turn around, or you'll notice your body turning around to go to the bathroom, in the direction of the bathroom, before you even actually say it in your head. So you'll be like, before you say like pee, your body will already be turning around to go to the bathroom. And those are the sort of things you don't notice in everyday life, but you'll notice on psychedelics. Or like coming down on psilocybin, I remember being in a car and I could see all the entire like emotional state of the driver as how they would hit on their brakes at the stoplight, like all the movements of the bumper. Or I remember being in a coffee shop and I could see all the muscle twitches in people's faces as they were speaking, so I could see their little insecurities. I was also talking about discontinuity last podcast. And another example of that in experience is taking like the yin-yang symbol, and you focus on the dark side or the light side, but you can't focus on both simultaneously. And it's almost like the side you're focusing on gets raised up off the page. And that's what I mean by discontinuity. We can't see like a continuous transition between a boundary. Whether it's in terms of change or if it's just in terms of difference. And also on psychedelics, it's as if we're seeing in high definition. And I was talking previously about how we could see our own hand movements as like a sequence of stills lined up again, one after the other. So I forgot what my point was. So even though you're seeing in high definition, there's a limit to resolvability for experience, to the point where we don't see the actual individual units of perception itself. And the same goes for the bottom of existence. There's a microscopic unresolvability, and there's a discontinuity problem as well for the bottom of existence, just like there's a discontinuity problem for experience. So non-experience and experience both have a discontinuity problem. And I say problem because we're not used to the idea of discontinuous exchange. Like when I hit my arm here, we see like a causal contact, but on a microscopic scale there is no contact. In fact, all we can actually see with a light microscope is the outlines of a cell and the structures in a cell. You don't actually see what you see as the stick figure molecule model. Now you might have seen pictures that look like that too, but that's like not directly seeing it with a light microscope. What that's doing is it's bombarding it with electrons or bombarding it with a laser, and you get like a built up image of that. So you're not actually seeing it directly. It's actually it's not empirical to say that there is a macroscopically imaginable atom or a macroscopically imaginable electron or proton or quark. And Wittgenstein used to talk about this, how in like the 20s and 30s that they were saying that the floor in which we stand on isn't solid, because they had the Rutherford experiments where they would scatter electrons or nuclei off of a gold nuclei, and they notice that the size of the nucleus compared to the rest of the atom, where all the electrons would be, is basically nothing. But I'm saying that it's not even 90%, 99% nothing. It's actually, the bottom of existence is not composed of anything at all. That the bottom is not, the bottom is the part that's unresolvable, the microscopically unresolvable medium. The idea that there's atoms and molecules are just a pattern of perturbations applied to these microscopically unresolvable mediums. So what I'm saying is, what we think of as matter, like atoms and electrons and protons, I'm calling it symbolic matter, that it only exists as the pattern of perturbations, and that the bottom of existence is actually unresolvable. But that creates all these problems, just like it creates problems for experience, where you have like a Zeno-like paradox for the exchange of these perturbations. You can imagine, you see, if you try to fill the unresolvability with something resolvable, like spheres, then you have a spheres within spheres within spheres problem, even though it's macroscopically imaginable. And so, in order to exchange energy between spheres, it has to first exchange to the spheres within the spheres. In order to exchange to the metaspheres, it has to exchange within these metaspheres within the metaspheres. And it just keeps on going, so that any kind of exchange would be indefinitely deferred, making all change impossible. So that's why it has to be microscopically unresolvable. But that leads to another issue, is if there's nothing there, then what's making it remain the same from one time to a next? So what makes an atom remain the same atom in between perturbations? And that's another question that I'm going to be talking about, but in a different section of this podcast. Back to the psychedelic experience. The most interesting thing that I've seen on psychedelics is on LSD. And I had already taken it like 20 times, and I didn't think I could see anything new. And so I took it, and what I saw in my head sort of resembled what theorists might call like wormholes. Like there's different overlapping mediums, and they're like connected through these wormholes, but each medium was like indefinitely detailed. And it was like, well, first of all, it felt like experience itself became a fluid, and that it was indefinitely detailed, and there was multiple they're interwoven mediums, overlapping, interwoven, indefinitely detailed, hyperdimensional fluid mediums, because it wasn't really a fluid and it wasn't really a structure, and it felt like it was like thousands of Escher paintings, like cut and paste together, where they all sort of were incompatible with each other, but how they were layered within the fluid, it was possible. And that's when I started to think about how it's already hard to comprehend from a purely scientific standpoint, like how ordinary experience is signified in the brain, because it's so in-depth, it's so detailed. But compared to what I saw in my head, that seems impossible to signify in the brain, or at the very least it was only partially signified. And partial signification opens the door to non-signification, if that makes any sense. But I'll talk about that at some other point. So, the other thing about experience is you can prove that there's an external world or a non-experiential world and brain from within experience by noticing that the human mind can't accept that there's an experience rather than some other experience, or experience rather than no experience, without an explanation, without a reason. And the brain is our narrative for that. I'm saying that we already accept that. We might say, like in a philosophy class, so somebody might say they don't think that, but they've already accepted it in their behavior. You watch their behavior every day. They accept that when they cover their eye, that they have a hand, they have an eye, and they know that they're covering up, making their eye unable to capture light. It's not like it's a mystery or so I'm saying that we can prove there's an external world without actually knowing literally or experientially, because we know that there has to be a reason why it's happening in some way rather than another way. What's my point? So the other thing about psychedelics is sometimes you can replay memories in your head, like of a situation where I remember I was talking to this girl, and then like a week later I had taken mushrooms, and I could almost replay the situation in my head, and I could tell that the girl was like interested, whereas before I like couldn't tell just by looking at her facial expressions in my head. Another interesting thing about psychedelics is it lifts the linguistic map that runs our everyday life. A good example is me and my friend, like 16 years ago, we went up into this private property, and we're in this secluded area where we're taking mushrooms, and we're trying to get back home, and we had to pass through this guy's land, and the guy was obviously like really pissed that we were crossing his land. And my friend, who was like 22 at the time, or 23, he starts bursting out laughing because he's like, his first realization that like there's no houses, there's no chairs, there's no flags, there's no countries, there's no cell phones, there's no cars, there's no yours and mine, there's no should and shouldn't. All those things are coming from our left hemisphere's map. When I say should, I mean should has to do with anger, and anger is almost exclusively activated by the left brain, and it makes sense because the left brain is limited in what it accepts as what's true or what's known, and so it's always going to have a limit to the amount of reasons that are accepted, that are true by what's familiar, and that's where the left brain also gets caught with this idea of free will, because there's a limit to the reasons that it's going to accept for someone's actions. It's not going to step outside of that unless it has to, unless it's forced to revise its reasons. So, God, I forgot what my point was. Left brain, right brain. One interesting thing about the two hemispheres is the folds of the brain on the left side are more pronounced than the folds on the right brain, and that seems to signify the difference between the hemispheres. Like everything's softened on the right hemisphere side, so when you see something, it's focusing less on the details of the object and more on the relationships between the objects, whereas the left brain's more focused in on one object. So you can see how that can be a metaphor. The left brain, it's all about specialization of knowledge also. This goes here, that goes there. What was my point? And oh yeah, back to psychedelics. So this whole linguistic interface gets suspended on psychedelics, and you see for the first time that there's that's what the Matrix is. We don't pay attention to it. We all accepted it, and even our sense of what's natural is consumed in it. So we don't even see a natural outside of this interface. The left brain basically is having trouble seeing the right brain. It's confused. It's the edge, like the boundary of its left hemispheric linguistic map, is being confused with nature itself, and I call it the hypernatural. And it's basically Einstein or these other physicists like Weil made an actual. They favored the geometrical interpretation of Einstein's general and special theory of relativity, and so the Einstein-Weil space-time hypernatural is the natural that's already reproduced. It's not part of nature, it's part of the artificial. And then there's the Big Bang and the black hole configurations of this geometrical interpretation of general relativity. And then there's a large and small version of each one. The large version of a black hole is the black hole, and the small version is what I was talking about before was spheres within spheres. That's how we see the bottom of existence, like mini black holes. And then the small Big Bang is for like one unit, and then there's a multiverse array. And you can consider that you could have you can imagine like an expansion of all the universes away from each other. Now, I don't believe any of this, right? I'm saying that this is the scientific worldview, or the paradigm. And so this hypernatural, it serves as a way of concealing the natural, but it also echoes it, meaning it provides a metaphor for its unveiling. And that's because every idea is a double-edged sword. It has a false expression and a true expression, or a not useful expression and a useful expression. So I'm saying that the Big Bang is a metaphor for what a pre-existential Big Bang that I'll talk about. And the general and special theory of relativity is a metaphor for what I call general and special rotations of the self-informing TaoWars hypermetric, and it has some of the same terminology, and it uses the same ideas but in a different context. So it's using relativism. So the hypermetric has 4 different stories of everything, or 4 ways of deriving everything, but it uses these 4 ideas, and the order in which they're used are the different stories. And one is a new kind of pantheism, another one's a new kind of panentheism, and another one is a new version of atheism,